So what we have before us today is 1 Corinthians 11. Well, this is a really interesting part of Corinthians. It has something to do with head coverings and the relationship between men and women, a little bit contentious. And so I would like to just walk you through what I think it means after having studied it quite a bit, and see if that's not a blessing to you and bringing clarity to the subject. So when we look at the first verse, and I'll just be doing sort of verses 2 to 16, and then we'll go from 2 to 16. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what words mean what, and then do some slight changes to the words. You say, now you've gone overboard. We're not doing this. We're not going to rewrite the Bible. Well, I don't want to rewrite the Bible, but there are some parts that would be more clear, and I'm going to do everything with your approval. Yeah, so we're going to walk through it and see, does this make more sense? Is this closer to what was meant or not? What I'm going to be focusing on in this section, and it's about the head. Okay, the head. And so the head of the man is Christ. Okay, and a man should not cover his head, and a woman should cover her head. And if she doesn't, it's like her head's being shaved. And of course, this relates to you prostitutes, or if you have a shaved head, it doesn't contrast enough the distinction between men and women. And there are all kinds of problems during World War II. The women, for example, in France, who collaborated with the Germans or had a German lover, their heads were shaved and they were walked through the town and mocked. So there's all this about head covering. And we want to get into, should we have these head coverings? I mean, what does this passage really mean? When you look out into the world, the flesh, and the devil are after everything that has anything to do with Christ. And so this is a big issue. If we look at the trans stuff, if you look to feminism, all of these things are attacking fundamental Bible principles like marriage, like sanctity of life, especially life in the womb, like the differences between men and women. All of these things are under great attack, so they must be important, right? So let's get it right. Yeah? So let's go to verse 2, and it says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. Okay, so he's giving instructions to these people, and he's saying, well, in general, you follow them, but we know the Corinthian church was like, oh, grace, so we're saved, so we're good? And then they went out and lived like the devil. He's like, no, what? So you're going to sin more so that there'll be more grace, that grace may abound? No, that's not how you're supposed to do it. And then you have we're supposed to put on the new man and all this kind of stuff. So the Corinthians were, a little bit loose on this. Verse 3, let's crack on. Verse 3, and here's where I'm going to start to change stuff. So, don't let me go too far off the reservation here. Verse 3, but I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, the word head here is kephalē. Kephalē in the Greek can mean the head, the top of something, the apex of something. The chief cornerstone, I think in Matthew, was kephalē, the chief cornerstone the temple would be built on. The head, the superior, the chief, the principal, someone to whom others are subordinate. But it's a little bit confusing because I have a head, and then we have also a head, but that's kind of our leader. So, and I think that's some of the issues here have to do with the translation of kephalē, head. So here in verse 3, this is a key concept, and let's just go through it again. I want you to realize that the head, the chief, the principal of every man is Christ. And the head, the chief, the principal of the woman, not the thing on top of her shoulders, of the woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. So we have a key here to translate what's coming up. And then when we get down in verse 10, you'll see how this is reinforced with the word authority, exousia, authority. And so between 3 and 10, this is some important stuff here. The head that Paul refers to is the head of authority and should be understood as such, whether literal or symbolic. Now, here's where the change comes. I'd like to reword verse 3. I already did a little bit, but I think if we read it like this, it'll be more clear. But I want you to realize that the chief, the kephalē of every man is Christ. And the kephalē, the chief of the wife, here it's really important that we put wife here. The Mounts Interlinear Greek edition does this. It's wife. Women are not to submit to men. Wives are to submit to their husbands. Men should take leadership also in the society. And you say, well, women should submit to the leaders. But if we're talking just strictly here, this is husbands and wives. But that's where I'm going with that. So I'm going with wife here. And chief of Christ is God. But I want you to realize that the chief of every man is Christ, and the chief of the wife is man, and the chief of Christ is God. That's a key. Okay. Verse 4. What it says in the NIV is, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Let's stay within the bounds of kephalē. Let's stay within the bounds of the meaning, the intention of Paul here, and say, every man who prays or prophesies with his chief covered dishonors his chief. And you think, well, so you like put a blanket over Christ, and then... Well, yeah, kind of. And so, if we look at, we were just singing some Christmas carols, and we were singing Christmas carols that were, honoring the Messiah, honoring Jesus. But if you ask most people about Christmas carols, they might start with, dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, this kind of thing. It has nothing to do with Christ. In other words, it's Christmas, it's Christmassy, but Christ is covered. In other words, something is covered, it's put out of the way. And so we don't want to cover Christ. We don't want to put our authority, we don't put our covering, we don't want to put it's also the word, a veil over Christ. So here in verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his chief covered dishonors his chief. And so where am I going to go with this? There are two streams here. One is, get the authority right. Make sure the authority is right in coverings and chiefs. On the other hand, what is that? How does that look symbolically in the church? And of course, it's going to be that men don't have a covering and women do have a covering. And what is that covering? Is it an actual piece of cloth, or is it their long hair? And I'm going to argue it could be either one. But it's not some, shaved head feminist like the president of Harvard University. That would not be the intention. Again, this is not a salvation issue. So if you say, Peter, you can just take a long walk on a short pier. I'm a woman and I want short hair, and that's just how I want to be. Okay, but I think it's taking you, step by step, fractionally away from what God's intention is for men and women. So we've got this thing about head and chief, and we're going chief, chief, chief. And now we get to verse 5. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. And you think, head, but not all of those heads are actually this thing here, but they're all kephalē. Huh? So, but the understanding should be a little different. This is how I've slightly rewritten it. But every wife who prays or prophesies uncovered, not under the authority of her chief, her husband, dishonors her chief, dishonors her husband. It is the same as having her head shaved. So, if I think about my wife and she decided to shave her head, and then we're sort of walking through the market, I would just be like, what is this? And people would be looking at it. It would be a dishonor. Maybe in today's society it would be less sort of dishonorable and more just sort of wacky. But it's certainly not going to bring me honor. And so here, the head, I'm translating the first two instances of head as her chief. And then the last one, I'm leaving it as her actual head being shaved. First part of the sentence is chief and authority. And the last, it's the chief and authority. And the last part is the symbolic. And it'll be the same in the next sentence as well. So having a shaved head was disgraceful or too much like a man. It's a punishment. This refers to the women are to have the covering authority of their husbands if they are to pray or prophesy or teach. And this doesn't seem to be the case today in the church, because if you look at the female pastor, and you shouldn't have female pastors anyway, but if you look at women doing things in the church, to what extent do they have the authority, the blessing, the covering of their husbands to make sure that happens? You think, we are strong, independent women. We don't need a covering and authority from our husbands. But you do, because that's what it says here. And when women and children do not have the authority and the covering and the protection of men, they are the victims. And if we look at society today, who is losing out? Who is losing out? Children, the transsexual horror, women are suffering. It's women and children are the ones who are hurt when men do not take authority and behave like idiots and scoundrels. So that is going on here. So again, here the verse transitions in the first part from chief as a simile for authority to the simile of head as a physical symbol or a greater principle. Let's go on to verse 6. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. Oh, how are you going to puzzle that one out, Peter? Well, I'm going to kind of do it the same way. The first sort of half or third is more about authority, and the last half of that is more about how that should symbolically look in church, so that there's a signal, this is a man, this is a woman, this is how our relationship is supposed to be. So my small changes here, and here I leave gyne as woman. For if a woman is not covered, you could say a wife is not covered, if she is not covered by her chief, not her head, if she is not covered by her chief, she might as well have her hair cut off. So she doesn't have authority on her and doesn't have that symbol of authority as well. She might as well just take all of her hair off and look like one of the prostitutes just going out and doing whatever she wants to do. She might as well have her hair cut off. And in the original it says, but if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off, I think it's better here, and, because it's not contrasting, it's building forward on it. And the word in the Greek here is just a conjunctive in general. It is, so and is perfectly good here. For if a woman is not covered by her chief, she might as well have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head, actual thing on her shoulders, shaved, then she should cover her head. So you say, well, I'm a woman, I like to have my hair shaved or whatever. Okay, but in the church, it would not be inappropriate to have the head covered, just to give that signal. Again, the first part of the verse refers to the key of verse 3 of what a head actually is, and the second part expands on the symbolic result of the woman not being covered. Verse 7, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Well, I just love this, because I am a man and I am the image of... And here we have to be really careful because that's not really what it says. What it says is, and let's do our sort of kephalē thing. A man ought not to cover his chief. So we've talked about that before. Don't cover up Christ. Don't put Christ to one side. Don't veil Christ. He is your chief, the men who should be doing the teaching and preaching. He is the one should actually be, front and center. A man ought not to cover his chief, since he, Christ, referring to chief, since he is his chief. So it should read like this. A man ought not to cover his chief, since his chief, not man, his chief, Christ, is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. And so you see, yes, that actually works better. Too bad for men here. But, and you see, well, that's quite a change, Peter. And if we were going to read the Bible, we need to read it, very literally. And you said, Scripture interprets Scripture. So, you need to have some backup for that. And there are a couple dozen places in Scripture where this does pop out, but let's just look at a couple of them. In Colossians 1, starting at verse 15, He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God. Well, that's what it says here. He's the image. Hebrews 1:3, He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. 2 Corinthians 4:4, Christ, who is the image of God. All the same word here. Verse 10, for this reason, a woman ought to have authority, this is exousia, on her own head because of the angels. So again, you're saying, back in verses sort of 4 and 5, you're saying, yeah, but now you're kind of changing it to show, authority on her head. She needs the covering from her husband. That's exactly what it says here. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Because of the angels, like the angels are looking down and saying, oh, it's a terrible hairdo or something like that. No, not at all. If we go back to Genesis 6:2, things go very wrong when women and children are not covered by men, sort of like having like a wingman. You can't go into a dogfight without your wingman. Genesis 6:2, in the NIV, it says, the sons of God, so these angels, sons of God, that could be a whole nother video, it's a really interesting study, saw that the daughters of humans, the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Now, that doesn't really convey the actual sense, because if you look at the Hebrew word there, the actual Hebrew word has much more sinister intentions. And so if we look at the King James, which is a little closer there, it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, so they were beautiful. And they took them, they seized them. They took them wives of all which they chose. So it's more sinister, more aggressive there, and I think that's really what it was. So for this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her own head, so that she is protected from the sort of obvious bad impulses of, in this case, the angels or even of other people in society. Nevertheless, verse 11, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Here we come back, and Ephesians 5 is a little bit the same. There's an authority, but you're supposed to love each other, and the man is supposed to love the woman as Christ loved the church. And so there's this mutual love and respect that needs to go on. Verse 12, for as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Again, here setting the appropriate hierarchy of authority and covering. Verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? So here I think it's more of a nod to tradition than an actual injunction from Paul. Although it should be noted that until the feminist movement in the West, Christian women worldwide covered their heads as an appropriate symbol of their husband's authority and of their position. Again, this is not a salvation issue, but I say that so that we don't have to fight each other and split the church because we disagree on one of these things. That's what I mean by not a salvation issue. I don't mean that it isn't important, because I think every time we take a little step away and say, yes, that was cultural. No, don't. If you find yourself saying, yeah, but that was the culture back then, some of those discussions are relevant, but the point, the principle, is going to be very contemporary. So don't give this. I heard this from this female priest in the Lutheran Church who said, if Paul only knew what we know today about LGBTQ, he never would have written those things. Yes, he would have. Okay, we're almost done here. 14, does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? No, Jesus didn't have long hair, even though you have, long hair shampoo model pictures of Jesus. 15, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for long hair is given to her as a covering. I thought we weren't under the law. It's not, but it's simply the symbolic side of the authority Christ, husband, wife, that we want to reflect within the church. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, he says, so anyone who wants to argue about it, this is the practice. We see this everywhere in all the churches of God. So, if you want to argue about it, fine. But, Christians everywhere are doing this. So as a symbol of man's relationship with God and wives' relationship to husbands, a head covering seems, in church, an appropriate symbol, even if it is only the woman's naturally long hair. What is long? Is this long? Is this kind of long? If it's kind of bunchy, long on top, but here it's a little bit short. Yeah, we know. Yeah, it's kind of like a Supreme Court justice in the United States said once, pornography is hard to define, but we know it when we see it. So a Raphael of a naked woman is not necessarily something we'd say, oh, it's pornography. But, the same kind of woman in the same kind of pose in a picture, you might say, oh, hide the kid's eyes. So here, I think it's kind of, we know what appropriately long is in our culture. See, culture. So let's read through this with just a little bit at one time with the changes that I made, or the clarification of kephalē that I have given. I'll summarize and we'll be done. So we're starting at verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the chief of every man is Christ, and the chief of the wife is man, and chief of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his chief covered, veiled, dishonors his chief. But every wife who prays or prophesies or teaches uncovered by the authority of her chief, the husband, dishonors her chief. It is the same as having her head shaved. So we see the authority hierarchy, and we see the symbolic expression of that. For if a woman is not covered by her chief, she might as well have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head, physical head. A man ought not to cover his chief, since his chief is the image and glory of God. We don't cover Christ because Christ, our chief, our head, is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her head from the husband because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So I think in summary, women and men have literally different roles. We have actually different roles. We have actually different authorities. That's part of this passage. And these actual authorities and roles can be expressed symbolically. And I would probably say should be expressed symbolically. We should have clear symbolic differences between men and women. Men should not pray or teach without due reference to Christ, their chief, and should not cover their heads. And of course, you've seen probably in movies where, a man with a hat on his head will meet a woman or meet someone of importance and will remove the hat, or they'll be at a funeral, or they'll go into a church and the men will remove their hats as a politeness. Wives should not pray or teach without consenting authority from their husbands, and should physically cover their heads or display or have long hair, female hair. It's not a salvation issue, again, but one under attack by the world, the flesh, and the devil. And if the world, the flesh, and the devil, through the LGBTQ movement and through feminism, the racist Marxism that we also experience today, if they find these kinds of symbols important enough to attack, we should know why, and we should push back against that. I'm not saying that, every woman needs to have a cloth covering, but you should display as a woman for your husband, and men, you should display as a man. And sometimes, I think you see more women that are sort of, if you will, guilty of this, dressing inappropriately in church and that sort of, and going out and thinking, I'm a strong, independent woman kind of thing. Don't you tell me what to do, or I have no authority over me, But men also fall down on this and are, dumb and scoundrels and lazy and going along with the world, the flesh, and the devil. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this exegesis, because we got quite deep in here. I hope you forgive me for tinkering around with some of the words, but I feel like I probably had your permission, because we stayed within the standard definitions, but we just tried to use slightly different words so that it was, more clarity between chief and head, and help us understand what Paul is actually saying to us in these verses. So until next time, God bless.